The sound of a running shower is usually a sign of a beginning, a morning routine, a moment of relaxation. But on an unseasonably cold afternoon in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that steady hum of water was masking a silent catastrophe. 7-month-old Adriel was a baby who needed help. He had spent the previous few weeks battling a persistent, rattling cough that his mother, Edith Estrada-Sigala, described as walking pneumonia. She had called out of work that day, claiming her only priority was her son's recovery. Her plan to save him was simple: a steam treatment. She would fill the bathroom with hot mist to clear his tiny lungs. It was an act of care that would, within hours, transform into a first-degree felony investigation. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. When the 911 call finally echoed through the dispatch center at 5:30 p.m., the tone was already one of finality. Police and EMTs arrived at the apartment complex to find a family shattered before the investigation had even begun. A grandmother in a yellow shirt paced the bottom of the stairs, her grief oscillating between Spanish and English, her screams warning the officers that the lady in the yellow was losing her grip on reality. At the top of those stairs, the air was different. It wasn't just the humidity from the bathroom. It was the heavy, clinical silence of first responders who had already stopped rushing. One EMT met the responding officer near the doorway. The assessment was grim. The baby's probably not going to make it. Inside, 28-year-old Edith was hysterical, her voice cracking as she tried to explain the inexplicable. She told the officers that Adriel had been sick all weekend, throwing up and struggling with respiratory issues. She had decided to give him a bath, but she was so tired. She admitted to passing out while the water was running. It was a narrative of a mother's exhaustion meeting a child's illness, a tragic, accidental collision. But as the officers moved through the small apartment, the domestic scene began to feel off. While Edith wept and spoke of pneumonia and doctor's visits, the police were noting the geography of the home. The laundry was half finished. The television was still on. And then there was the bathtub. It was wet, just as she said, but the timeline she was providing started to warp under the slightest pressure of questioning. She claimed she had been asleep while her son was in the water, but the house didn't feel like a place of rest. It felt like a place of secrets. As the paramedics worked on Adriel's limp, 7-month-old body for 20 agonizing minutes, the officer stayed with Edith. He asked for the boy's date of birth. She struggled to remember. She whispered July 6th, then faltered on the year. The disconnect between a mother's supposed hypervigilance over a sick child and this sudden, localized amnesia was the first crack in the foundation of her story. Then the announcement came. At 3:07 p.m., according to the official logs, the firemen stopped CPR. A doctor on the other end of a phone line pronounced Adriel dead. The apartment was now a crime scene, but the police were playing a careful game. They told Edith they had to photograph the home, just because it's standard procedure. They didn't tell her yet about the items they were seeing in plain sight, items that had nothing to do with pneumonia. As Edith was led down the stairs, she believed the police were there to support a grieving mother. She had no idea that while she was being escorted out, an investigator was standing in her kitchen, staring at a collection of empty bottles that told a much darker story than any medical diagnosis ever could. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The transition from a home to a police interrogation room is a calculated move in any investigation. For Edith Estrada-Sigala, the process began in the freezing air outside her apartment. The police were no longer just listeners. They were observers. While Edith pleaded to be near her son, claiming she didn't want him to be alone, when he was taken to the office of the medical investigator, the detectives were executing a search warrant that would strip away the facade of her tired mother's story. Inside the apartment, the search revealed a staggering amount of alcohol. This wasn't a single bottle of wine for a stressful evening. This was a house littered with buzzballs, high alcohol, pre-mixed cocktails, and empty shooters of Pink Whitney, a pink lemonade-flavored vodka. There were also remnants of jungle juice, a potent, homemade mixture of various spirits. The sheer volume of containers suggested a pattern of consumption that didn't align with someone who was taking a day off to nurse a sick infant back to health. By 11:30 p.m., 6 hours after the initial call, Edith sat in a stark interview room. She had been read her Miranda rights, yet she agreed to speak, seemingly confident that she could explain the accident. She leaned heavily into the medical history of her son. She talked about his diaper rash, how she wanted to keep him comfortable for daycare, and how the steam was the only thing helping his choking cough. She described undressing him, putting his toys in the tub, and then retreating to the bedroom to wait for the dryer to finish. "I don't know how I just fell asleep," she told the detectives. This was her anchor. If she was asleep, she wasn't negligent. She was just a victim of her own fatigue. She claimed she only woke up because her mother was knocking on the door. She described a frantic half-asleep search for Adriel, eventually rushing to the bathroom to find him unresponsive in the tub. But the detectives weren't focused on her sleep. They were focused on her breath. Even in the sterile environment of the station, hours after her last supposed shot, the room began to fill with the distinct, sweet-sour scent of metabolized alcohol. The lead detective, a man who would later tell her he had seen his fair share of party houses, noticed that Edith wasn't just smelling of a single drink. It was a deep, systemic scent that suggested a much higher level of intoxication. When the detective finally brought up the alcohol found in the home, Edith's demeanor shifted. She admitted to having friends over recently, but claimed she was the only adult living there. She tried to frame the drinking as inconsistent and here and there, but then came the pivot. She admitted that today, the day her son died, she had taken a shot of Pink Whitney. Just one. She said she did it while doing laundry, while Adriel was sleeping or playing. She called it a way to take the edge off. The detective leaned in, his tone shifting from sympathetic to skeptical. He told her plainly that he had been in the game too long to be lied to. He pointed out that a single shot taken at noon wouldn't still be radiating off her skin at midnight. He was about to present her with a biological reality she couldn't outrun. The math of her one shot didn't add up to the death of her son. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The interrogation room became a pressure cooker as the clock ticked past midnight. The detective chose a unique tactic. He didn't berate Edith. He related to her. He spoke about his own time in college, his own experiences with drinking, and his ability to recognize a party house versus a drinking house. He told her, "I'm not buying what you're selling." He was trying to get her to admit that the nap she took wasn't a result of exhaustion, but a result of a blackout. Edith tried to hold the line. She insisted she was sleep-deprived because she had been at her boyfriend's house the night before. She admitted that they had been cooking and drinking whiskey, and that she had gotten pretty tipsy. She described driving her children home that morning while hungover, dropping one off at school, and returning home with Adriel. This admission was a critical error. By her own words, she was admitting to operating a vehicle with children in the car while potentially still under the influence. The detective pounced on this. He asked her what she thought she would blow if he gave her a breathalyzer right then and there, 12 hours after her supposed last drink. Edith faltered. "I don't know," she whispered. She finally admitted that she did indeed have a drinking problem. She confessed that she would take shots just to do laundry or to take the tangle away from a hangover. This was no longer a story about a sick baby and a tired mom. It was a story about a mother who needed a drink to function, even when her 7-month-old was fighting pneumonia. Despite the mounting evidence, Edith refused to change the one-shot narrative for the day of the incident. She claimed her high tolerance and the fact that she hadn't brushed her teeth were the reasons she still smelled of liquor. But the detective challenged the very core of her steam room defense. If Adriel was as sick as she claimed, galling and choking and unable to breathe, why would she leave him alone in a bathtub, even for a moment, let alone long enough to pass out? The investigator's voice remained calm but firm. He told her that he would be the one at the autopsy the next day. He promised her that Adriel wouldn't be alone. It was a psychological masterstroke, contrasting the detective's commitment to the child with the mother's alleged abandonment of him in his final moments. Edith's defense was crumbling. She was trapped between two versions of herself: the grieving mother who cared too much, and the woman who admitted she took shots of vodka to get through the afternoon. As the detectives stepped out to confer, the reality of the situation began to settle in the room. The search warrant had turned up more than just bottles. It had turned up a timeline that suggested Adrielle had been left in that water far longer than a simple nap would account for. When the door opened again, the detective wasn't coming back to ask more questions about her drinking habits. He was carrying a set of handcuffs and a warrant. The time for honesty had passed, and the legal consequences for what happened in that bathtub were about to be read aloud. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The final act of the interrogation was swift. The detective informed Edith Estrada-Sigala that she was being placed under arrest. The charge was staggering: child abuse resulting in death, a first-degree felony in the state of New Mexico. In an instant, the woman who had spent the night arguing about the smell of alcohol and one shot of Pink Whitney was officially a defendant in a homicide case. As the handcuffs were clicked into place, the detective's tone remained professional. He noted that she had been cooperative, but the facts of the case, the wet bathtub, the intoxication, and the death of a vulnerable 7-month-old, were enough to meet the probable cause for the arrest. Edith, who had spent hours trying to maintain a facade of a tragic accident, was now facing a reality where she could spend the better part of her life in prison. The investigation didn't stop with her arrest. The Office of the Medical Investigator would perform the autopsy that the detective had promised to attend. They would look for the presence of water in Adrielle's lungs and verify the severity of the pneumonia Edith had used as her primary defense. They would also look for any signs of prolonged neglect. The state's case was built on the premise that Edith's passing out wasn't a medical event or a result of simple fatigue, but a direct result of voluntary intoxication while she was the sole provider for a sick infant. Public records and the ongoing legal proceedings highlight the gravity of the 2026 trial date. In New Mexico, child abuse resulting in death is treated with extreme severity, often carrying a mandatory minimum sentence that leaves little room for leniency. The steam room defense, the idea that she was trying to help the boy's respiratory issues, would likely be countered by the presence of the alcohol and her own admission of a drinking problem. The victim in all of this, 7-month-old Adrielle, remains the focal point of the tragedy. He was a child who, by his mother's own admission, was struggling to breathe and needed constant care. Instead, he was placed in a bathtub while his mother, by her own admission, took a shot of vodka to take the edge off a hangover from the night before. The tragedy isn't just that he died, but the conditions under which he spent his final moments, left alone in a room filled with steam while his mother passed out nearby. As the case heads toward the March 2026 trial, the community of Albuquerque is left with the haunting images from the body cam. The hysterical grandmother, the damp bathroom, and the quiet, small body of a boy who never reached his first birthday. Edith Estrada-Sigala remains in the system, her life forever marked by the afternoon she tried to take the edge off and lost everything instead. The story of Adrielle Estrada is a grim reminder that in the world of true crime, the most harrowing details aren't always found in the violence of the act, but in the silence of the neglect that preceded it. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, empathy, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button, like, and comment your thoughts below. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.